This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to two journalists, Nathan Paul Southern and Lindsey Kennedy. They've just got back from a trip to Afghanistan where they were reporting on the drugs trafficking situation in the country now that the war was lost and the Taliban has won. Essentially, it's the Taliban's Afghanistan now. The Taliban said that they're going to put a stop to this stuff, but actually in some ways it's only gotten worse. People are making more money, and if they stop with this drug dealing, then some people are actually going to starve due to various blockades. It's an interesting situation. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/popularfront. You've just come back from Afghanistan covering kind of, post-war, at least the, victory for the Taliban. It's now the Taliban's Afghanistan, and you've been covering the illicit drug trade. Tell us about that. It's something I think a lot of people don't really realize is going on in Afghanistan. With, from the limited understanding I have of it, it's actually pretty massive.
Yeah, I think for us, always really interested in the drug trade. We do a lot about organised crime and trafficking around the world, and I was really curious what was going to happen when Afghanistan went to the Taliban in loads of respects, right? But drug trade specifically, when you've got about 80% of the world's heroin and a huge amount of the world's meth coming out of there, is that now going to change? Now the guys that were taxing it and running it in certain places, now they're actually in charge of the country. What's going to happen? Are they going to have a legitimate police force? Are they going to try and crack down on it? So we were really, really interested to go there and actually see how the drug trade is going to develop, and it's just all over the place, between massive production increase to them announcing bans to seeing. We went down one street at 2 p.m. And seen about 50, 60 people huddled, just taking heroin and meth on the middle of the street, and then would meet with a senior narcotics officer just an hour or two later, who would be adamant that there were absolutely zero drugs left in Afghanistan. So it's just this crazy time where no one kind of really knows what's happening. So you're trying to bring the satellite imagery in, and then talking to people on the ground and trying to make a bit of sense of what the situation is.
Right, and what did you find then? What obviously it's chaos, but what did you kind of work out? What's happening? What's the situation, and how has it changed since the Taliban took over?
Okay, well, so before the Taliban took over, it was pretty clear that they were using the heroin trade to leverage quite a lot of money to fund their activities, to fund their insurgency, right? And they announced after they came into power they were going to completely have this blanket ban on heroin across the country, on opium growing across the country. So when we got there, we don't usually apply for proper media visas everywhere. No. We often try and go under the radar a little bit, but this time we were okay, we're not taking any risks this time, and which meant that we kind of had to check in with different sort of Taliban outposts all over the country, and then so we drove from Kabul down to Kandahar and Maiwand, which was kind of felt nuts in itself, because for the last 20 years that would have been a death wish, even trying to do that drive right. But they were kind of surprisingly okay about us covering this story, but when we got down to Maiwand, they assigned us a soldier for our protection, who was basically sort of like a minder, who I think was And I think the idea was that he would just make sure we didn't maybe go to the wrong places or ask the wrong people or ask questions you weren't supposed to ask. But this guy clearly, I think this was we were probably the first foreigners that he'd met that he wasn't trying to kill. So it was a kind of weird dynamic, but also he obviously hasn't had any media training and stuff. So at the beginning of this trip, he was kind of waving his Kalashnikov around a lot and being really aggressive. But when you're in a car with someone for 7 hours, they inevitably they have to kind of soften and just have a chat after a while, right? So by the end of this trip, he decided that Nathan was his best mate. Having kind of looked through me and pretending I didn't exist at the beginning of it, by the end of the day, he actually shook my hand, which was mental. But he also just started opening up and saying stuff that I think he just hadn't thought through, that this was exactly what he was to not tell us. So he was saying, he's not had a salary. He'd been in the army. Well, he'd been fighting for the Taliban for 15 years since he was 15. And that whole time he said he'd never actually had a salary. His family had been like basically the only means of like raising money was growing opium, and all soldiers in his regiment or whatever, they all they would all grow opium to survive. So he was very much like, so this hits me too. I don't know how we're going to survive. And everyone we spoke to told us the same thing. Like, we don't know how we're going to survive if this opium ban comes into place. At the time, we were like, we weren't entirely sure from looking around, because it did seem like a lot of these farms had actually been stopped.
They're going to do it, yeah.
Yeah, so we were like, are they actually going to try and enforce this ban? I mean, it'd be an absolute disaster if they do, because these people are going to starve. But since then, this guy we were speaking to has like sent us pictures of his opium that he's been growing and his farm that's back in play. So it does seem like it was kind of a bit of a performance at the time of saying, oh, we're shutting everything down. When really we think probably it was more of an attempt to consolidate control over the industry and make sure the Taliban was able to tax it more. So yeah, the opium trade definitely hasn't gone away, and like, there's been UN estimates over the last month that say it's like there's more opium being grown than ever in Afghanistan.
And it was a weird thing, because we were expecting it to be like complete bullshit when we were there, and that we would just see poppy being grown on the side of the road. But all of the places where it was supposed to be cultivated, it did seem to stop. And every farmer that we asked was saying, no, they told us to stop, so we stopped. And it was like checking out, because there was like, we went to Mailand originally because we heard there was a full drugs market there where they would process some of it into heroin, like refine the poppy, and also take the ephedra, like and make the meth, and then they would travel over the border to Pakistan. So we want to find this drug market. When we got there, I mean, the soldier ended up being the one that took us there. They were all like, no, it stopped. And you're trying to work out like, whoa, what's the propaganda, what's real? But everyone was kind of saying, oh, it looks like it stopped. And then maybe at the time they thought it was going to, because this soldier was like, maybe now they'll start to pay us, they'll start to get us some money, and we won't need to grow poppy. But that's not happening. Like, the country's getting less and less money. There's no way that the Taliban can afford to keep the population from starving. So maybe they gave it a small effort for a while, but in reality, it was just never ever going to work.
So the government minder who was assigned to you to kind of make sure you didn't, see any kind of drugs or poppy growth, then showed you he himself was still growing it. That does sound to me. Yeah, that does sound to kind of check out, though. It sounds like perhaps they were serious. They're like, no, we got to stop this. But then, I don't know, do you think it's a case of they've just realized, like, we can't subsidize this any other way? Maybe they've just been like, you know what, turn a blind eye to it, or what?
I think there's a few things on it, right? So Afghanistan is one of the only places in the world that had some success in a war on drugs. And that was like in the late 90s, that they tried it a few times with different bans on poppy cultivation. And like around 99, he did actually have a bit of success in like reducing the cultivation, and then the world's heroin supply went down for like a year. And that's like the one successful case study of like a drug war that actually had some success. But it only lasted a year because the country was broken after fighting with the USSR. They needed cash. The Taliban quickly realised that they could only hold on to this for like 12 months. The value of it, just went up anyway, so no one really lost money who was in the game. And then after that, it just started to naturally break, and then the war kicked off. And once the war was there, there was no question. Okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to tax this really heavily, and we're going to make a lot of money, and we're going to use that to fight the insurgency. But in the 90s, the conversation was saying, well, when the Taliban was trying to take full consolidation and control of the country, then trying to stop the drug trade like helps legitimize the regime. And the UNODC at the time did think if the Taliban get full control, we do think drug production might go down, have these kind of religious rulings on it. And now I think it's a similar kind of game since they took over, where they really need money to come into the country. And all the Taliban that we were talking to are saying, why won't the international community recognise us? And I was like, you don't let girls go to school, man. I mean, that's the main reason. But that's something that's like religious and political, and there are different factions fighting over this. They can make a big song and dance that they're cutting down on the drug trade. And maybe even if they just say that might be enough for a little bit of aid to flow in, or some sanctions to be released, or for them to be looked at like they're a serious, legitimate government. So I think saying it makes a lot of sense, but in reality, the Taliban run most of this trade or tax the other part. So in reality, I think what they were doing was consolidating control of the heroin trade, and possibly if they did reduce the actual amount that was coming out of the country, then that would just increase the value of heroin and meth and increase their profit share over the trade.
But yeah, I think this is the thing, that there's definitely like different factions, right? That's the thing as well. Like there's guys that are really senior, especially guys that have been living in like Qatar for the last however many years and stuff, who've not really been in the country, right? Who like really do. I mean, they really are adamant. They're digging their heels in. Like they shouldn't, they shouldn't be growing. The country shouldn't be growing opium either for like ethical, moral, religious reasons, or they find it really embarrassing. I don't want to be seen as a narco state, right? But then everyone who's actually trying to implement this further down the chain, they all know, I think, that you can't actually do this, because if you really enforce this, half your your loyal base, your supporter base for the last 20 years, they all rely on this to survive. And if they actually start starving to death, you're going to have a civil war again. You can't maintain control because you're not offering them anything else. It's really, really hard to grow anything else. So it's really hard to shift onto another crop with no funding and no support. And there's no international help right now because there's still a pariah state. So whatever your goal is, whoever, even if everyone at the top of the chain is adamant that you need to eliminate opium, everyone lower down who's actually having to tell people you're not allowed to grow opium anymore, they know this is a disaster. It's going to affect their ability to hold on to control. So I think there's kind of like a mismatch the further down the chain you go.
They are a pariah state, and I know obviously the situation where they've stopped girls going to school is absolutely disgusting, but I don't know, I find it hard to believe that that's the only reason the West is like doesn't want to play ball with them. I mean, the EU just came out and praised Azerbaijan, who has leading members of government openly cheering on for a new genocide of Armenians. And the EU were like, yeah, these lot are great. Why? Because the EU is now getting gas off of Azerbaijan because of the Russia situation. I'm wondering, is there any kind of resource in Afghanistan that would, make the so-called, red lines of the EU and the West go away for the West if they had that? Because it's not just drugs that they have there.
There's a lot of natural gas, and there's a lot of like precious metals and like huge amounts of kind of like jewels and like rubies and sapphires. So there's a huge mining capability in Afghanistan. I don't think the EU, Western companies, or like the Americans are anywhere near being able to get in there because of the sanctions, but the Chinese are.
Yes, this is the point I was coming to, yeah.
So the Chinese are setting up, the Chinese are trying to set up really big, right? And they're setting up special economic zones in Afghanistan. And I mean, we've seen this around Southeast Asia and a lot of the other work we do, where special economic zones, you've got a special arrangement with the government where you pay less tax, you don't have your goods looked at too heavily if that's in a port, and you've got, these preferential trading agreements. They're looking to set these up in Afghanistan, where they would basically have their own rules within places like Kabul. And it's already begun. So when you come out of the city, you can already see these huge mining concessions. But a lot of the Chinese have been specifically targeted from IS attacks in Kabul mostly. So some of them are kind of getting a bit cold feet and backing away just from the danger aspect of it. But financially, definitely, they're going to go in. And China, with their Belt and Road Initiative, like they make it clear that they do not care about any form of human rights, right? Whether the Americans, the EU do, or they just pay lip service, they at least say something, right? They have to play the game. The Chinese that is not our concern. That is not what we do. That's the internal affairs. So Afghanistan is basically, as much as like the EU and the US kind of dance around recognising them, engaging with them, but what's going to happen is you're going to have China and also lesser so Russia just come in and make huge influential gains with the mass amount of resources there, which won't go to the Afghan people. they'll be completely stripped out and sent to China. But then you also have that kind of geopolitical benefit of them making a base in Afghanistan, which the rest of the world will kind of miss out on. When you talk to Afghans, they are so annoyed. Like, that is one of the things that they are most pissed off at, is that they know that the Chinese are coming out and just ripping the resources out of the ground, and none of it's going back to them.
It's exactly the same thing that China does when they go to Africa. Basically, it's just maybe it's less hostile zones for them over there.
Yeah, it is. I mean, what's going to happen is probably something similar to the DRC, where you've got a high intensity conflict zone where human rights and labour rights don't exist, and then Western companies might kind of be a bit hesitant to set up there. Maybe they'll want an in-between to get things like cobalt, right? But the China will just go in and get it all, make huge amounts of cash, and then none of it goes back to the Congolese. China are doing this like all around the world, and Afghanistan's just like the next big target. And you see quite a lot of Chinese business people kicking around Kabul and just like eyeing it all up and making the Chinatown Kabul centre, building up. And it's a weird time with that.
But like, just going back to just like what you're saying though about like what would the recognition question though, I don't think it is all just about like for like the EU and the US and stuff. I don't think the question really is about whether or not they can get access to the mining concessions and stuff. I actually think it's a lot simpler right now. Like, if you think about the fact that, the last time the US like lost a major war, like if you look back to like Vietnam, like they excluded Vietnam and Cambodia, and refused to deal with any of the governments that had come in for years and years and years, because and it wasn't really that they were getting anything out of it more than we have wasted so much time and resources and money, and it's embarrassing, right? It's really embarrassing. Yeah. If you don't, and I genuinely do think that they, all of like our governments, like they put up with so much, like in terms of like assaults on women's rights from their allies, and it's like Afghanistan really wouldn't have to do very much. It literally would have to just say, we're letting girls go back to school, and that would probably be enough just to tick that box, so that you haven't just wasted 20 years and ended up in exactly the same place. But it is like really difficult to explain this to people, like when like out in the countryside and stuff, because a lot of the places that we were talking to people who, like when we were talking to opium farmers and stuff, they, we're explaining, well, the West can't be seen to recognize this country, and it is a massive thing. Like, you talk to women and girls in Kabul, and their lives have been completely destroyed. They have been upended. It's not. This isn't like a this is a major issue, right? But in the countryside, when you're talking to people and you're saying, but girls can't go to school, and they're saying, well, we don't have a school in this village. Our boys can't go to school either. It was bombed and no one's rebuilt it for 15 years. And it's really hard to explain to people why girls not being able to go to school is a complete red line, but girls starving to death because you can't get aid in, that's acceptable. And that's when the recognition question just becomes like really kind of on the nose, because you can't really start building anything up in these really impoverished rural areas without aid coming in, and you have to start with recognition to do that.
And I think that girls' school issue is the one that has just slowed it all down. Like, I think before that announcement last year, when they really went hard on it, I think before then everyone was trying to edge towards a way to find recognition and make it work, right, to an extent. And we were like I said earlier, we were constantly asked, like, why won't the world recognize us? And it was a really weird day where we had meetings in the Ministry of Interior, which in Kabul was this like huge compound that was an American base, and when you go in, it's designed like an American suburban street. And like they've got like the little weird like houses that they have like out in like Minnesota or whatever it would be, and then they had like yellow school buses, like they were actually from the US sitting there, and then it was just all Taliban flags just like hanging over it all, and they were like so proud to like to bring us in. And say, hey, do you know what this used to be? And I was like, dude, I might be a big guy, but I'm not American. Don't like, and they were just so proud, and they bring us in, and then there was a lot of sitting around drinking tea, and this is like your Kabul guys, right? So who are a little bit more, I don't know, like Lindsey was alluding to, they're a bit probably less philosophical with the religious stuff, and they're involved in like a bit of a life, and they've gone really into social media. but we just kept getting asked, like, why won't you recognise us? And one guy said, you know, like, what is it? What's actually going to stop you doing this? I'm like, man, it's like, if you actually say that girls can't go to school, then you're leaving no option. This is a bit of a game for a lot of the world. There's been relationships with like the West and Saudi Arabia forever, and they don't let women drive, right? And they have, you know, public punishments. I mean, they do now. Yeah, that's changed.
They just hire slaves to build stadiums, and that's fine. yeah.
And then we, you know, send our World Cup to Qatar, and like you can get. And I was saying to him, I was like, man, you can obviously not trying to give advice to Taliban, but like you can get away with some bad stuff in this world and still have good relationships with the so-called developed world. You just can't say certain things. And then what this guy, he was like, oh, of course. Well, what it is we're actually going to let the women go to school. But right now we're just working out the uniform and the curriculum. And then he said something, and he said it to our fixer. He told us later what he actually said, like in his ear. And he was like, look, if we let these girls go to school, we are going to get horny when we see them.
Jesus Christ.
That's where we're actually at with a lot of it, you know?
Well, a lot of things, I find a lot, I've been like reporting on stuff in war, and you'll find stuff where, things like that, where if you came back and told an analyst that, they'd be like, oh, don't be so ridiculous. It's like, bro, it's that simple sometimes. As fucked up as that is, it's sometimes that's as simple as someone's decision making on the ground. It's not your embargoes, it's not your diplomacy, it's something that fucking horrible. Yeah, and that's the reality. Also, I think as well, you made a really good point there, both of you really, because it's, I mean, the point of, okay, they take you into this like former American thing with these American buses and there's Taliban flags on it. That's basic. That's why. Because to not deal with them is revenge, and to deal with them is to accept that you completely messed up. You know what I mean? And obviously, you know, that's the way, despite all of the bravado, that's really the way things work. You know what I mean? It's like big bully versus small bully. That's kind of the way the world is. That said, though, obviously in this environment, like you said, the embargoes, they can't make this money. The drug market is going to start thriving again. What is the kind of process? Where are they selling this stuff? How do they make the money? Because if you're growing some poppy in a field somewhere, and even the Taliban are saying you can't do that no more, how do they then make the money from it? How does it work?
So it seems like the exact same supply routes that were there before are back again, and actually it's now, although the Taliban might make some shows of cutting down the odd poppy field, the production seems to be massively going up of both poppy and ephedra, which is the kind of main plant that actually grows in Afghanistan, which is used in methamphetamine, and production there is absolutely booming. So a lot of this is not just cultivated in Afghanistan, but it is also processed into the final drugs as well. And then it's as simple as that being put into a Land Cruiser and crossed over the border into either Pakistan or Iran. And then there's like different kind of supply routes that will end up in the Balkans or go towards Asia of the heroin supply. But increasingly, a lot more of that heroin is now, and the meth is ending up in Iran and Pakistan.
Right, the meth gets processed in Iran, I read. Is that true?
Yeah, a lot. So there's a lot of it does, but there's also Iranian meth and there's Afghan meth. And apparently the Afghan meth is a lot worse than the Iranians, because they're still kind of working out their processing style for it. So although the Iranians are making some and the Afghans making some, the Afghan stuff is still crossing into Iran as well. But I think also the ephedra gets shipped over into Iran, because they have shut down some of the factories that were producing meth, but I think other ones have kind of have popped up. And when we were, we know that during the war, the Taliban were either like directly taxing this or like taxing it or directly actually involved in it. I think now huge factions of the Taliban have really just become a more traditional organised crime group that are trafficking these drugs, processing them increasingly inside Afghanistan, and then trafficking them over the border. But there's also a domestic market for this as well. I think there's about it's something near 10%, yeah? And when we would speak to users in Kabul, and then they would say there was absolutely no issue of supply. But since they announced the ban, the prices had went up. But they could still get both meth and heroin just as easily. And then when we speak to some dealers, I'm like, all right, well, where do you get this stuff from? And like, from the Taliban. And we thought it was just, that was kind of like a general like, oh, everyone's corrupt. And it's like, no, directly from the Taliban. These are the guys. This is since they took over. These are the guys that sell us. We go to this neighborhood, and I won't say the name of the neighborhood. We go to this neighborhood on the outskirts of Kabul, and if you want to buy some weight, then you get the kilo packages of heroin and meth, and there's a Taliban stamp, like seal, on the bag. And then what that means is, like, if you're driving back to Kabul or, on a bike, and the cops stop you at one of the checkpoints and they're like, whoa, what's this? We're like, oh shit, right, you've got the steel. On you go, which sounds ridiculous, but this is something that me and Lindsey have found in other parts of the world. In Thailand and Myanmar, the huge amounts of meth that's coming over the border from Myanmar right now, ever since the coup especially, and then flooding throughout Southeast Asia. And the traffickers we spoke to said, oh, it's just a really simple way. Like, we've paid off all of these border checkpoints in Thailand and in Myanmar, and we've got the stamp. And the stamp, they know, all right, first of all, send that through here, and then they also know how to divvy it up when they get to the warehouses. They've got these little complex networks of stamps.
So it's a business for the Taliban.
Yeah.
So not much has changed.
No, it's not. And like, we're still in touch with those dealers in Kabul and saying, is there anything different? Like, maybe there was a rough period when they were changing over. Surely the government's not just the local drug dealer still, as obvious as that. It's like, no, it's still the exact same. Just the price has just got higher, and that's it.
It sells for 5 times as much now, so nothing has changed except they're making 5 times the profit.
Right. So in a way, things have got better.
Yeah.
For them.
For them, yeah.
Great time to be a Taliban heroin dealer. In a way, this is a positive thing, because if the Taliban really did try and crack down on this, what you would have is mass starvation throughout the country. Most likely, even more instability. Like, the country's not at peace. It's just the Taliban have taken over most of it. There's still some small, low-level conflicts and insurgencies raging, but it's the most stable it's been in a while. That would end very, very quickly if you had this really well-armed, starving, angry population not allowed to trade in the one cash crop that they have. But on a bigger level, like, the world is different now on drug supply. And if Afghanistan did manage to crack down on, if we're just talking the heroin trade, Europe's not been as hard hit by fentanyl yet, by synthetic opioids. But if less real heroin was coming out of Afghanistan, the shift to fentanyl, it would probably take like 1 to 2 years. And then it would absolutely flood all of Western Europe. Eastern Europe, it's already been hit a little bit already, and the UK, and you start seeing something similar to what we've got in the US, in Canada, and Mexico, where the overdoses are just going through the roof, because fentanyl, you don't know what kind of dose you're dealing with, and it can just cause those overdoses so much easier. And it's all synthetic, so you could just completely cut Afghanistan out of that supply chain, and you could just have it from the Chinese producers and the Mexican cartels moving fentanyl around the world. And then once the cat's out of the bag with fentanyl and synthetic opioids, then you're in a really, really bad situation. So in a way, for the millions of heroin users around the world, a steady supply of heroin coming out of Afghanistan will probably actually save some lives.
That sounds like a house ready to just completely collapse. It doesn't sound to me like the Taliban outside of Kabul, etc., is really being able to act like a state. If people are having, I mean, it's all well and good to be like, oh, well, the heroin shouldn't be done there. Like, I've seen a lot of Western powers be like, oh, it's terrible that they're still doing this and the heroin. It's like, well, if people have got to eat, they will eat. That's how they eat. It's not their fault, really. It really isn't. But if the Taliban isn't providing for them, it's kind of their fault. What's the solution to this? Or is there like anything even being done to look that way? Or is it just like fuck it, we'll just keep growing, we'll just keep doing it? Because it sounds to me like there's not a lot of time left before that really implodes.
Yeah, I mean, like the big thing right now is that, like, Afghanistan's, like, before the Taliban came into power, I think something like 60% of the economy was propped up by aid for basically for the entire Karzai government. So the country just can't survive without that. So you'd have to start bringing the only way to get around that is to start having like relationships again with the outside world, so that major NGOs can come back and start actually providing basic healthcare and education. And I know that's not like a permanent plan, but it has to be what happens in the short term. And the only way that like farmers are going to shift away from opium into other kinds of crop, which actually they would be a really good thing anyway for Afghanistan, because they've got major food insecurity in the country as well. They have to import so much right now. So you do want people growing like other kinds of crop more, and not everyone just switching to wheat as well, which just causes the price of wheat to drop and sort of screws everyone over that way as well. But the only way they can move on to other kinds of crop is with like a fair bit of investment and support and access, more reliable access to water sources, and that all takes money and investment. And people living hand to mouth in Afghanistan are not in a position to do that. And the Taliban has no money. The Taliban really does have no money. Unless they're selling opium, they don't have any way right now really of raising any cash. So the only real way to, in the short term, to basically make sure that people don't starve is to have more interaction with NGOs from the outside world. And that's why the Taliban's pushing so hard for it, and why they're pushing so hard for recognition, so they can start doing that as well. They know that.
Yeah, it's one thing to be funding an insurgency through drugs, but then to fund a whole state and a whole country is a lot different. The meth is interesting to me. How do they make meth there? How is that? Is it just the same as you would make meth anywhere? Because if it is, I think, well, then why bother doing it there? Is it because they can make so much of it? What's the situation? Like, I get the heroin, the poppy's there, you can cultivate it, but the meth, what's the story behind that?
It's because ephedra, there's a plant called ephedra that's not used in all meth production, but it grows wild in the hills.
So it's like organic meth, basically.
Yes, organic meth. Yeah.
It sounds good, and I don't do drugs.
Very
business. But so it basically just means you don't have to invest in, you don't have to have any land or invest in your crop production. You can just, if you're happy to walk up into the hills and collect it up, someone will come and pick it up from you as well. Like, someone will drive to your village and pick that up. You don't have to get to the next town over to sell it in the market. So you can make a lot more money out of that.
So just having the plant.
If you're happy to walk up into the mountains and harvest it organically, from the mountains.
Because it depends on where your village is, because either you'll come back and there'll be some kind of processing plant nearby where they'll turn it into meth in Afghanistan, or they'll just sack it up and send it over the border to Iran where they can process it into meth there. But it all grows naturally, and I mean, the Taliban barely have the capacity to even just decide amongst themselves if they're going to let half the population go to school, never mind starting to go into the forest to get rid of one certain type of plant that grows everywhere. And then the demand for meth is just increasing so much around the world, and especially around Central Asia and around Pakistan. And a lot of that, it's like a lot of the drug use is because of trauma, right? Like most people in the world, the vast majority who have a problematic relationship with drugs, and most people don't, even with things like heroin and meth. It's still 20% have to use it every day. So they do have trauma. And around this part of the world, there is so much trauma. So the need for these drugs that numb the pain is really only growing. And you can have second and third generation PTSD because the conflict has been so bad. So that need's always going to be there. But then there's also just this kind of growth of different types of industries mean that meth is just really useful for a lot of workers, because if you're in construction or if you're driving trucks and lorries across the country and you need to stay awake all day, meth really helpful for that. So there's this huge surge in demand for it. And meth is a lot more difficult to stop because you don't need these enormous poppy fields that some guy in DC can be watching satellite imagery and going, oh yeah, well they've increased by 17.3% on here. It's like, you have no idea what's going on because some guy collects something off a hill and then there's a factory somewhere and you can't find that. So it's really impossible to cut down even if they wanted to, which they don't because they're making massive profits on it.
That is really interesting. In terms of drug use within Afghanistan, I mean, are you still seeing that? Is that kind of obvious. I remember years ago watching a really good documentary by Ben Anderson about Afghanistan. I think it was This Is What Winning Looks Like. And there's parts in that where even the Afghan soldiers that are working with the Americans, they're like smoking opium on guard duty, falling asleep, dropping their guns. Like, not everyone was like that, but it was like it's clearly a significant problem. I was wondering, is that still an issue like that, like in the population? Because we have seen these very dark images of Taliban being like, yeah, this is how we deal with drug dealers, and they just put them in a room and like lock them up. It's really dark. Yeah, is that still happening?
Yeah, that's still a massive problem. So like, yeah, there is really high drug use. I mean, at one point we drove around, there's like a big park in the middle of town, which is quite near where all like the embassies are actually. So it's like quite a nice part of town. And as you drive along the outside of the park, I mean, we saw like 50 people, 50 guys, all crouching down, smoking heroin or meth, just in the middle of the day, like openly. It's everywhere. But when we interviewed drug addicts and drug dealers, they like some of them had been put into these re-education camps, which just are like rehab camps, whatever, and they're absolutely horrific. Like it's basically just torture. And they were told they weren't allowed, they weren't really given any food, and they were so hungry they were like picking grass to eat, and then you'd be beaten if they saw you picking the grass to eat. And it was just they sound like they're absolutely horrific. I would say that I'd be very surprised to see an on-duty Taliban soldier or guard or anyone like openly doing any kind of drugs, because they have a lot of like pride about this stuff, and they have to be seen as like actually following the rules. But yeah, generally like, among the sort of more general population, definitely very openly. And I don't think they've done anything to actually reduce addiction.
There's also just historically always been a different culture around certain drugs in that part of the world. Like not just heroin, but hashish as well. And it's always been a bit more acceptable to like have a wee smoke, even of opium, than it would be to like drink a beer. And that's what the addicts would tell us. It was like, oh yeah, I mean the cops will come, and like some of the addicts and some of the dealers we were talking to would be arrested, and they'd get out a few days later after some torturous camp, and they'd say, oh yeah, no, they treat you really bad, but it's not it's not a big crime. It's like all we're doing is selling a bit of heroin. That's what one guy said. He was like, I don't know why it's such a big deal. I'm just selling some heroin. It's not like I'm selling beer. And like the Taliban would look at like alcohol use in such a harsher way. And that punishment would be so much more severe if you were seen to be selling alcohol. Like you can find heroin, meth, hashish incredibly easy around Kabul, and I didn't see any alcohol whatsoever, and that is something they go so hard on.
Is that because it's like a foreign thing? I mean, it's obviously kind of, no one's really brewing the beer there. If you've got beer, you've got it from the West, or essentially the enemy, whereas if you're doing heroin, you've just picked it out the ground from your own country. I mean, do you think it's something to do with that, or is it religion, or what?
No, I think it's just religion. I think it's just because it's like alcohol specifically banned, and everything else is just like, oh, I guess that's the same spirit of the thing, I guess. But like, it's not seen as like a serious moral crime the way alcohol is.
So they smoke cigarettes still, or no? That's still banned.
So they say that it's banned. That's something that was supposed to be banned under the Taliban. And you, like, to be fair, you don't see it everywhere, but I definitely seen like a fair few stalls just openly selling cigarettes. But people smoking is actually a bit less than I thought it would be. It's banned, but it's still done. I think it's like you can go buy a pack of cigarettes and just like stand around the corner away from the Taliban guard, and they're not going to care too much. But it is something that has had a little bit of impact. And there were like, we were able to like actually walk around Kabul in a way that we wouldn't have been, a year ago. And you go into the market. I mean, you can only be there for 10, 20 minutes before someone is eyeing you up to kidnap you or rob you, right? And when you were there, our fixer would go and change some money, and I was like, all right, I better get like this money in my pocket. He's like, man, you don't need to worry about getting robbed. Like, the Taliban are everywhere. That's one thing that's not an issue anymore. Like 2 years ago, you've been kidnapped, you've been robbed instantly. You can walk down the street holding that money in your hand, and you will not get messed with. And so like that street crime. Yeah. I mean, it's pretty high. Yeah, it's like low petty theft is not going to be an issue, but someone might take you and sell you to ISIS. But there's not the low level stuff. So the Taliban have maintained and have introduced some level of stability to people's daily lives. And I think that's a really interesting thing we found there, so we would speak to like women's rights activists who are obviously enraged and so incredibly upset, and we speak to people working on human rights. And we would just kind of assume that they would hate the Taliban so much they would just be desperate for them to be gone. But their point wasn't to get rid of the Taliban. They said, we've been trying to get rid of the Taliban for 30 years. It doesn't work. The Taliban are part of this country. And when the US first came in and took the Taliban out in 2001 and 2, the initial peace talks didn't include the Taliban, and it never seen them as an integral part of the country. And unfortunately, they are. So many rights activists are saying, look, we need to find a way to work with the Taliban, because if we try and get rid of them, it's just more war. And we can actually now walk to the shop. We can go to the market. We can live some form of life that was just such an alien concept to us for the last 20 years. We are done with war, and that is just the conversations we had across the country. People saying we're done with war. I might hate the Taliban. I hate everything they stand for, but please do not try and get rid of them, because we'll just go back into decades of car bombs and shootings and full-scale conflict.
It's sad, but in that sense, you can totally understand it. You can't then say, oh yeah, by the way, you've had rockets for the last 20 years, but now you don't. You should still be mad and want to get rid of them. Like, no, obviously the situation with women's rights is just appalling, but I can understand why someone living there is going to go, you know what, there's peace now, okay, like whatever. You know what I mean? It's sad, but people get worn down by minor things, let alone constant death and violence, you know?
Yeah, I mean, this is, if you're 18 years old, if you're 20 years old, you've never known a life in Afghanistan without war. And there's so many young people just say, I mean, this is the first I've seen it, and these guys are awful. And they really, the hatred toward the Taliban is visceral as well. I mean, you see it. You see the way that people look at these guys in the street, and you see the way, like, you can spot them. Like, you know, our fixer was like, I was like, all right, so show me who's the Taliban guys in the street. And he was like, in a few days you'll be able to spot all the Taliban.
Really, you can tell, yeah.
You can, and there's certain kind of ways that they dress, but that's also a cultural for certain parts of the country. But also, like, you can just see the swagger. There is a walk, and you're like, Talib, and you just know it, and it's like, we've taken this place. Yeah, we are running it, and the way that they'll stop you at the checkpoint, and you see them, whether in all ages, whether it's like some Taliban kid with his Kalashnikov or some old guy that's seen decades of conflict, and they'll come up, and it's just their chance to like just push their weight around a little bit, and they weren't going to give us too much hassle. They would scare us a little bit, or they would try and make our lives a bit more difficult, but they were very aware that there's no benefit of the Taliban now hurting foreign journalists. And we had one guy stop us in the roadside, and you've still got burnt out police scars from IEDs just on like one side of the road, and you got the Taliban on the other side of the road, like kind of dragging you out of the car, and trying to give you a little scare, but then also a bit of a joke and say, hey, you're very welcome in this country. And I said to one of them, I said, like, that's great, I appreciate that, but 1 year ago you would have kidnapped and beheaded me though, right? Yeah. And I was like, yeah, but it's not 1 year ago now.
What a difference a day makes, eh? A couple of inches of your neck. In terms of, I know like Taliban right now is in quite, I mean, maybe low level, but it seems quite a serious battle with what is essentially ISIS in Afghanistan, the Khorasan province. Is the ISIS groups, I mean, they're, for want of a better word, they're about as straight edge as they come, I can imagine. Are they using this kind of drug situation to kind of, as propaganda against the Taliban, or is it just people don't care? I mean, to be honest, I know a lot of Afghans, and I don't know a single one that sees like ISIS ideology as remotely Afghan, but still, ISIS Afghanistan is still in some ways thriving.
I think their communications are quite limited. Like their propaganda propaganda is not really there. They're not holding land and territory. So, I mean, I guess it would make sense to talk about how they weren't, as pure. But the Taliban are publicly saying they're cracking down on the drugs. So I don't know if that would work as well. And I guess for ISIS-K, their financing mostly comes from foreign donations. So they've not kind of had to dirty themselves with the drug trade as much. But I think there's a lot of crossover as well. Like, it's not the Taliban and ISIS-K, they are in conflict. But there's a lot of guys that seem to switch a little bit as well. Like, it's just such a culture of war and insurgency that it's quite hard to leave that. So you find a lot of the checkpoints after 8 p.m. are no longer manned. And that's because there's ISIS attacks. And then there's also factions of the Taliban that will fight other factions of the Taliban at night. So when 8 p.m. rolls around, the whole country is checkpoint after checkpoint, and that's actually been one of the main ways that the Taliban have always kind of financed themselves as checkpoints. And now that you actually don't have warlords running every individual province, it's actually a lot easier to move trades. People are okay for checkpoints, but you think this is some kind of security, but the 8 p.m. rolls around and so many of them just stop. And then, then the Taliban start fighting themselves, and then ISIS start fighting the Taliban. And then some of the fighters within the Taliban are also kind of connected to ISIS as well. And I'm not sure if there's a part of just kind of dipping your toe in and just keeping a little bit of a hand just to see where the conflict might go.
I think, I do think as well, like, everything is still very tribal outside of the big cities. And like, so I think if you, to an extent, like, if your village and your clan have like kind of got an allegiance to a particular group, but that's just what you do. I don't know how much kind of like sort of, I don't know how much of the doctrine you're really analysing and trying to figure out, how much it matches your view of the world, and how much it's just like, that's who we are allied to because that's our village. Like, I think it's just more like that, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think like international analysts will look at like a struggle for some territory with two groups of guys with guns, and maybe find that one of those guys had an ISIS flag or had links to one guy that was known to be an ISIS, and then calls it a conflict between ISIS and Taliban. But like you said, a lot of this really is just quite tribal. And I mean, even when you're talking to the Taliban soldiers, I mean, that guy that we said earlier that we were stuck in the car with for hours. When we asked him, like, why did you join the Taliban? It was like, well, his brother was killed in a drone strike. And I'm like, well, that makes sense. And none of it was like some hardcore religious ideology. I mean, a lot of these guys can't read. Like, they can't read religious texts. They've not. There's not even like. There's many kind of mosques around. You're in such a rural area, and you have very little idea in a way of what's going on. I mean, we were talking to one community and said, "Oh, what do you think of the Taliban's like drug ban?" And they said, "How would we know about that?" It's like, sometimes our radio works, but like, usually it doesn't. Like, we only know what's in this community, and all we know now is that maybe it was the Americans have stopped dropping bombs on us. And you've just got like a very, very poverty-stricken and violent country, and sometimes the allegiance to which group, whether it's warlord, whether it's ISIS-K, or whether it's Taliban, I think means a lot less for the people on the ground. But when observers are trying to make sense of Afghanistan, it's good to be able to point to different groups that are fighting. And actually, often it's just a bit of chaos fighting over the local control of resources.
And people are kind of like, I mean, Afghanistan has like loads of different ethnicities living in it who speak different languages as well. And like traditionally, like the Daris have been sort of wealthier and more urban, and have had more like positions in government, and like that was kind of affects what languages are spoken in the cities. And the Taliban are mostly like Pashtun, right? So they're now changing the language, everything to Pashto, and like that. So you have a lot of stuff that's more about ethnic and cultural lines and asserting dominance of your language than it is about kind of different religious sects, like, I think, as well. Which has been really traumatic as well for a lot of Dari people living in Kabul, who suddenly all of their street signs have changed to Pashto and stuff. So I think that's kind of that's more of where like another fault line is in the society than just
we referred to it earlier, but again, it goes back to these guys that have been living in Qatar for the last 20 years, right? And like put up in like nice hotels and apartments and getting to sit around with a cup of tea and debate the Quran and debate Islamic texts and how an Islamic country should work. And then the Taliban fighter on the ground is like, I don't know, it's like someone just gave me a gun. And that was how I kind of kept my family a bit safe, and I'm part of something.
Yeah, people don't seem to realize that like Afghanistan isn't just like Kabul. You know what I mean? I think that's a big part of it as well. Like, I know I have a friend from one of the very rural parts, and what she kind of explained to me as Afghanistan to her was completely different to what I'd ever heard Afghanistan explained as. And it was kind of like what you were saying. She was like, yeah, like, you know, we'd be lucky if the radio worked. You know, we'd be lucky if we had this. And it's not because like, oh, yeah, they're backwards or whatever. It's just like very rural living in like very different conditions. You know what I mean? It's just completely disconnected. And it's a big place as well, right?
Yeah, but also when you drive out to Kandahar and stuff, like, you know, every single electricity pylon and everything has been blown up, was blown up during the war. Like all of the infrastructure was destroyed. It's going to take a long time to rebuild that as well. It's not just that the country hadn't thought of it. You know, it's been under siege for 2 decades.
We had like one when that soldier came with us. We wanted to go visit one village specifically, and he insisted on taking a specific way, and we worked out on the way back that he'd added like an hour and a half onto the journey to try and show us that the road was worse than it was. Because when we sat down with this local Taliban chief, his main grievance was, we need roads. You know, like the Afghan government and the Americans blew up all of our roads, and we have pregnant women and sick children and sick men that need to go to the hospital. They need to get to the clinic, but you've just seen how bad the road was. And it was quite smart the way they took us around. I mean, it's still bad, right? It's still really underdeveloped, but they were really pushing that. And one thing he says is like, I don't understand why we can't just get a pickup truck from the government, you know? Like, we are so poor, we really, really need the help. And I was like saying, so you're kind of criticising the Taliban that you're now part of for not actually giving you any of the government support. And then it was like kind of backtracked and realised that he was trying to criticise the international community, but had accidentally criticised his own government now for not providing the basic things. And then when you're in Kabul, all these Taliban guys with their swagger are driving around in brand new Land Cruisers and Hiluxes that have been obviously like taken from the Americans. But you don't need them in the city. And then when you go out to the countryside, these guys are nothing.
Yeah, and it only takes one charismatic guy to recognise that with a lot of dedicated people and go, hey, why have they got all this? We should have that, you know, and then before you know it, there's a next war. I mean, it's kind of what happened in the 80s to a degree with the warlord situation.
Yeah, 100%. That is all that's waiting to happen in Afghanistan.
All right, I've got to go, but is there anything else you want to say about the drug trafficking in Afghanistan? And secondly, where can people read your work on this? I think it's like talking to you now, I think that's like the most important kind of journalism that can be done. Like really going there, understanding the thing, and just not focusing on, I don't know, whatever is now popular on social media within war conflict, or like, you know, this analyst said that. It's like, yeah, none of that matters when you're there and you're seeing that stuff. So yeah, where can people see this stuff that you're doing and follow you and all of that stuff?
So follow me on Twitter at Nathan P. Southern, and if you want to look specifically at the Afghan drug trade, check out our piece in Foreign Policy. If you search my name and Lindsey Kennedy's name, Foreign Policy, it'll be the last piece we wrote for them. And we've got some other pieces coming out for the South China Morning Post on recognising the Taliban and how that works. And yeah, I mean, like, and just kind of in terms of anything else to add on it, just say that, like, you know, a lot of these trends and things aren't unique to Afghanistan. A lot of this, the misery around the drug trade and desperation that comes from it is usually just out of kind of financial inequality and a really messed up drug war that's needless and just killing tens of thousands of people for no reason.
Yeah, the one war that will never be won, and yet still everybody wants to fight it. Lindsey, where can we get hold of you? And
so I'm also like for Twitter's easiest for me. It's Lindsey Kennedy. And we're going to be putting out some stuff. Now we've had like sort of our bigger features that we'd had commissioned from this trip come out. We're going to be putting out more stuff that's like more sort of behind the scenes of what we saw on the grounds. That wasn't, when you come back from a trip and you've got like so much stuff that gives you a real picture of a country, but it doesn't quite fit into any of the articles that you've been working on. So we're going to be putting out a lot of that just to give people more of an idea of what life is like on the ground and how all the kind of organised crime stuff fits into that over the next coming weeks.
Yeah, like when you spend a day with a soldier and he insists on showing you the videos of how you make the IEDs that kill the Americans, but you can't actually fit that into an article sometimes. It's not relevant, but it's pretty interesting.
It's very interesting. Yeah, no, definitely. No, I mean, that's kind of in a way why we started Popular Front, was to bring together all these kind of niche things that don't just fit into one spot, because they're actually what give you a way bigger understanding of a conflict. I say the more niche and detailed you get, actually it becomes more easier to understand, I think. In some way,
definitely.
All right, thanks very much. Really appreciate that. If you need anything from us, you want to come back on, just hit me up. That was really, really interesting. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you. That was Nathan P. Southern and Lindsey Kennedy speaking to us about the illicit drugs trade in the Taliban's Afghanistan. You should definitely check out their work, read what they're doing. I think they're really good journalists, and it's very interesting to see people doing these stories after the kind of hubbub of the hype of the end of the war has gone away. Really important stuff. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please do consider supporting us at patreon.com/popularfront, or you can buy merchandise at popularfront.shop. It all helps to push things forwards. We do not accept money from large corporations or governments or think tanks or any of that nonsense. Thank you very much to our sponsors. They are Oracle Coffee Shop in Portland, Oregon, USA. They're an independent coffee business selling only fair trade products. See them at 3875 South West Bond Avenue 97239. If you go into the shop and tell them Popular Front sent you, you will get a free coffee or money off a coffee, something like that. Depends what mood the people are in at the time. Thank you to Grindcore House, a pair of independent coffee shops in Philadelphia, USA. One in South, one in West. Find them on socials at Grindcore House. And our final sponsor, Propagandopolis, an outlet selling and writing about historical conflict propaganda from around the world. You can buy prints at propagandopolis.com. Use a promo code POPULARFRONT10 for 10% off. Follow us on social media, Instagram at popular.front, Twitter at popularfront_, TikTok is at popular.front, and watch our documentaries on youtube.com/popularfront. We're launching a Mexico page very soon to report solely on the narco conflicts. That will be starting at Instagram at PF_MX. We are fully going to announce the whole thing properly soon, but get ahead of the game, go and follow that. So please do, people, consider going and checking that out. We're trying to move into different things and have people actually from the region, report on these situations and write about them and keep people up to date on various conflicts that are going on in their neighborhood. If you want to support us, like I said, the best way, patreon.com/popularfront. Music in this episode, where am I? The intro was by Horam and the outro was by Sam Black. Check his music out at samblackpf.com. Thank you to the higher tier Patreons. They are Viola Forvel, Christian Bustamante, Victor Villa, Daniel Verdin, Margosha, Rohan Irvin, Titus Perkins, Ryan Barbadillo, VS, Brian R., Evan Pank, Bradley Hope, Wizard Actual, Claire Hoffbauer, Benjamin Topper, Chongus Bongwater, Siddhartha O, Damien, Cameron Collins, Nicholas Blomberg, Matthew Diffley, Claire, Liana, Robert, Sean, Christianovich, NTHG, Arturo Rafael Macias, Ethan Zwick, Kefi is the Mind Killer, Peter Nybratton, Gabriel K, Lisa Middlefat, David McManus, Tom Petrie, James Leons, Bradley Davies, No Dogs, No Hamsters, Brendan Crave, BRX, Ben Marshall, Dallas Dunn, LD50 Seattle, K Glitter Vulcan, Adam H, Bottle of Water, Larson 8669, Ivan Julien, Bjorn Kirsten, Diamondstein, Michael O'Connor, Jack Doherty, Nicholas Butter, JD, Jarv, James Cully, Tynan Daly, Ethan, Shanklin the Painter, Fitz Madrid, Ed Coulthard, D San, Mike Barone, Liam Williams, DZA, Giorgio Arani, The Vegan Straight Edge Global Cabal, Amy R, Rubicon, Frank Austin, Amelia Me, Christina Rivetti, Freya Northman, Nebo, Noah, Andrew Hurley, Vida Provost, Brian McLaughlin, Tom Lochrin, Young Wasabi, Tony Bin, JL, Stephen Davila, Dan Dunham, Chad Walker, Lawrence Abrahams, Peter McCormick from What Bitcoin Did, Christopher Martin, Ryan Sandercock, and Maurice Zumbul. Thank you all very much. Really do appreciate it. Support Popular Front, patreon.com/Popular Front.